It was a quiet Friday evening when I decided to go camping alone in the woods near my hometown. I found a nice spot by a small lake, surrounded by tall trees and distant mountains. I set up my tent and started a fire to cook some food. The sun was setting, and the sky turned a mix of pink and orange, making the whole scene feel peaceful as the night crept in. The forest came alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on my face while I ate my meal. Everything felt perfect until I noticed something strange. Every so often, I thought I heard a twig snap in the distance. At first, I brushed it off as a deer or some other animal, but the sounds grew closer. My heart started to race as I told myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After some time, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, hoping to forget about the odd noises. The tent was snug and warm, but sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside continued, but now they were different, heavier, more deliberate. I listened closely, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the noises kept getting louder, and I could hear what sounded like footsteps moving around my campsite. Suddenly, the fire outside flickered and went out. The darkness enveloped everything, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the blackness. I unzipped the tent and peered outside, scanning the area. The woods were eerily quiet now. The only sound was my heartbeat thumping in my ears that I shined the light around. But there was nothing to see, just trees and shadows. I was about to go back inside when I noticed a shape standing near the edge of the trees. It was tall, and for a moment, I thought it was just my imagination. But then it moved slightly, and my heart dropped. I felt a primal urge to get away, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I crawled back into the tent, zipping it tightly. I knew I had to keep quiet and think. I grabbed my phone to check for service, but there was none. The battery was low, and I had no way to call for help. My mind raced with possibilities. What if someone was out there? What if they meant harm? After a few agonizing minutes, I decided to act. I couldn't just wait for whatever it was to approach. I packed my things quickly but quietly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I knew I had to leave the campsite, but I couldn't just run blindly into the woods. I carefully unzipped the tent and took a deep breath, then stepped outside with my flashlight. The night was cold, and the air felt thick with tension. I shined the light towards the shape, but it was gone. It felt like time stood still as I stood there, frozen that I didn't want to stick around any longer. I decided to head back to my car, which was parked a good distance away. I gathered my courage and started walking along the path, flashlight in hand. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, but I kept moving. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my pace steady, focusing on the faint beam of light ahead of me. After what felt like hours, I finally saw my car in the distance, the moonlight reflecting off the metal. I hurried towards it, relieved to finally be almost there. When I reached the car, I quickly got inside and locked the doors. I took a moment to catch my breath, still on edge. I drove away from the campsite, not looking back. The woods were beautiful in the daytime, but at night, they felt alive in a way that terrified me as I pulled onto the main road. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I realized I was safe. The woods were now behind me, and whatever had been lurking there would stay there, far away from my world. It was a night I wouldn't forget, but I knew I wouldn't be camping alone again anytime soon. Many years ago, before smartphones were around, in the late 90s, I went on a camping trip with two friends far north in a place similar to Lapland. The summer was ending, the mosquito season was over, and the air was starting to cool down as autumn neared. We had packed food and supplies for a 10-day trek. Back then, I loved outdoor adventures. We parked our car at a visitor center lot within the boundary of a vast national park near the Russian border. It was an immense, wild area, stretching almost 1,000 square miles. The terrain varied greatly, from open, barren hills to dense woods filled with birch and spruce. There were plenty of swamps, and it was common to spot reindeer. On some nights, you might even hear wolves howling. There were also bears in the area, though they usually stayed away from humans. We mostly camped in our tent, but sometimes we used basic shelters or huts that were freely provided by the local forestry service for travelers. The journey had taken us 5 days so far, and we were at our most remote point, miles from any sign of civilization. No towns, villages, or even industries were nearby. It was a huge national park, and seeing other hikers was a rare event. Occasionally, you might spot someone in the distance, but you almost never ran into anyone directly. Around the midpoint of our trip, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by a seemingly endless stretch of forest. Night had fallen, and after finishing our dinner, the three of us were cramped inside our only tent. It was tight, but we all fit. It was a large tent that we had been taking turns carrying. We were joking around in the dark, laughing like guys in their 20s do, just before falling asleep in our sleeping bags. That's when we heard it, a voice and the sound of machinery. Given how isolated we were, this was really strange. We were in a tent because no huts were nearby, so maybe someone else had set up camp close to us. But we couldn't quite understand what was being said. It definitely sounded human, but the words were too faint, and the machinery sounded heavy, like an excavator or something else powerful, operating somewhere nearby. The odd thing was, it was late at night, and we were in a protected natural reserve, far from populated areas. We got out of the tent. The air was cold and pitch black. Our campfire had died down to glowing embers, so we took out a flashlight. My friends were much braver than I was. They decided to go investigate. The sound seemed to be coming from the north, about half a kilometer away, likely behind a small hill nearby. There were no lights, and we still couldn't make out the language of the voices. It was a droning, monotone voice, too low to identify any specific words. It's similar to hearing voices in static noise, like when using a hairdryer and mistaking the hum for someone talking. The machinery noise continued, growing louder and softer, as if idling at times. My friends decided to check it out, so they put on warm clothes, laced up their boots, and set out. I stayed behind, adding wood to the fire to keep it going. The guys grabbed a compass and a map, turned on their flashlights, and started walking towards the sound. I could see their flashlight beams flickering as they moved into the woods, and soon, they disappeared from sight. The strange noise continued, unchanged. They had been gone for a while, first 15 minutes, then 30 minutes, and eventually close to an hour. Based on the distance of the sound, they should have reached it, investigated, and returned by now. I added more wood to the fire and strained to hear anything from the voices, but couldn't make out a word. By now, they had been gone for over 2 hours, and I wondered if they had gotten lost. I built up the fire, yelled their names, and waited, feeling increasingly worried. After what felt like forever, I finally saw their flashlights returning. They came back, out of breath, and told me what happened. They had followed the noise up the small ridge but couldn't get closer. The sound volume never changed. They walked for a while, pausing to listen every few steps, but it stayed distant. After realizing they weren't making progress, they turned back, and as they started to return, the noise stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch. It turned out the sound seemed to stop at different times for us. I heard it stop at the 2-hour mark, while they said it stopped about an hour and 15 minutes after they left. It was strange because they had been gone for about 2.5 hours in total. Somehow, they ended up semi-lost in the dark, but eventually, they spotted my fire from a hilltop and found their way back. We didn't sleep that night, Nothing else unusual happened on the rest of our trip. 5 days later, back at the park's visitor center, we asked if anyone knew about construction in the park, but no one did. It still bothers me to this day. My 2 friends and I were exploring a well-known hiking spot in the region, yet we never figured out the source of that odd machinery sound in the middle of nowhere. Two years ago, I went hunting with my father and his friend, whom I call my uncle. They've been hunting together for around 35 years, mainly after moose. But sometimes, if moose isn't available, they hunt bison, elk, or caribou. Every season, they get a moose tag each, with someone grabbing an elk or alternative tag, just in case. They also carry a bear tag each, one for black bears and one for grizzlies. When we hunt, we're usually a full day's boat ride away from any sign of people, sometimes even more. Our only connection to the outside is a satellite phone. Out there, you have to be ready for anything that might happen, and if things go wrong, you can only hope that you'll be able to explain it to the authorities later. So, by having those bear tags, we're covered in case we need to protect ourselves, though they'd never used the tags in over 3 decades, even with numerous bear encounters. One year, we stayed in a plywood cabin along the river, owned by an outfitter my father knew. He mentioned that another friend who recently used the place had issues with a bear, so they added tin sheeting to the outside of the shack. We were familiar with bear safety, and the area is bear territory, so we weren't worried. The first night went smoothly, but we noticed fresh bear droppings the next morning. So we stayed alert, kept our rifles handy, and talked loudly all night. To keep the bear away, we banged on scrap metal, creating a loud echo through the hills. The next day, we were up early to hunt but didn't have much luck. We met some campers on the river who were upstream from our spot. One of them knew the outfitter who owned the cabin and told us that someone had previously tried to bait a bear there by leaving hot dogs out each night, intending to hunt it. But the person never went through with it and just kept feeding the bear, making it accustomed to humans and food being available. Later, when we returned to camp, we saw signs that a bear had been there. One of our fuel cans was dragged into the trail, punctured, and leaking. Our food storage was also ransacked, half the food gone and debris scattered around. The bear had clearly been here, and it seemed to be watching us from nearby. We spent the rest of the evening making as much noise as possible to scare it off. We even marked our territory by urinating around the camp, hoping the smell and noise would deter it. While scouting around, I spotted some tracks that suggested it might be a grizzly, though they were small and unclear. That night, we heard it outside the shack, sniffing around and even stepping onto the porch. Despite our yelling and noise, it didn't back down. It was then we realized this bear had no fear of humans. We were in a serious situation. All night, it circled the shack, chuffing and pacing, sometimes peeking in through the windows. We wanted my father to sleep so he could be well rested, as he was our best shot. But as dawn approached, we knew a confrontation was inevitable. The bear became more aggressive, even trying to open the door. As it tugged, flashes of morning light slipped through the gaps around the frame, a sight that still burned into my memory. Finally, my father prepared his rifle as we resigned ourselves to what had to be done. Though none of us had ever wanted to harm a bear, we realized this one had been ruined by human carelessness, making it too dangerous. My father fired the first shot, hitting the bear in the lungs. It tried to stand, but the second shot kept it down, and a final one to the skull ensured it wouldn't suffer. Afterward, we sat, reflecting on the situation and processing what had happened over coffee. We saved the skull and hide to report the incident, as required. We didn't eat bear meat due to potential parasites, so we left the body behind as per regulations. It felt wrong, like a senseless end to a majestic creature that never should have learned to see humans as a food source. We reassured ourselves that it wasn't our fault, though it was the result of careless people feeding it. We moved the bear a few hundred feet away from the shack, knowing wolves in the area might find it. For the remainder of the trip, everything went smoothly, and we successfully hunted moose. When a conservation officer came to check our tags, we explained what had happened. They assured us we did the right thing, and they took the skull for disease testing, which could help understand this unnatural behavior. They later returned the tanned hide to us, a reminder of both the bear and the heavy responsibilities we carry out in the wild. This bear's behavior was so odd it barely seemed real, a tragic consequence of people failing to respect these powerful animals. I live in rural northeastern Pennsylvania, deep in the woods. I work nights, so on my days off, I'm usually up until the early hours. One night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I was watching Netflix, just unwinding, when I heard a single knock on the outside wall of my mobile home, about halfway down. It was a solid knock, almost a thump, and immediately the hairs on my neck rose. I paused the show and listened for a few minutes, but it was quiet, so I dismissed it and went back to my show. After a little while, I heard a similar knock from the other side of the trailer. This time, it made me a bit uneasy. I grabbed my handgun and went toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, something held me back. I decided not to open the door, sat back down on the couch and listened. Nothing else happened that night, though I felt on edge. The next night, same time, I was watching Netflix again when I heard rustling outside in the yard. I picked up my Glock and went out onto the deck, flashlight on. There were deer around the house, which is common here, but one of them seemed strange. It was larger and its body looked odd. It was just on the edge of my flashlight's reach, giving me a bad feeling. I pointed my Glock at it, and it walked away at an awkward angle, not bounding like a deer normally would. Its head stayed angled toward me, watching me, which didn't sit right. I watched it disappear into the woods, then went back inside. The next night, I was at work, and when I came home, my girlfriend asked if I could take a gun out of the safe, load it, and put it in the bedroom closet. I asked why, and she told me she'd been up feeding our newborn and had heard a loud knock on the door that unnerved her. It scared the baby, too, and neither of them slept well after that. I hadn't told her about my experiences with the Knox, so it was odd. I think the creature might have been a not deer. I've seen something similar years ago while driving late at night on a back road. Something roughly human height with glowing eyes that stared at me before vanishing into the trees. It gave me chills. My main worry, though, is the knocking on my trailer walls. I'm really not sure what's going on. Just for context, I'm in a clearing with no trees closer than 60 meters, so it's not like acorns hitting the walls or anything like that. Any ideas on what this could be? It's a 150-foot waterfall that takes close to 45 minutes of uphill hiking to reach. We decided to climb around the rocks at the base of the waterfall, where there are small pools and boulders with water flowing down. This rocky path isn't on the main trail, so most hikers don't venture there. That's when my friends and I stumbled upon a young woman, about 24, lying face down in the mud, both her legs broken with exposed fractures. She had no phone, no water, no food, and nothing to keep her warm. Next to her was her friend, who had sadly not survived. We immediately called for emergency help, gave her any supplies we had, and eventually, a helicopter arrived to take her to the nearest hospital. We learned she had been hiking with her friend the previous night when they both fell off the waterfall. Her friend likely tried to get help, but unfortunately passed away less than 100 yards from where we found her. No one had any idea she was there or injured. It's incredible she was still alive, and thinking of everything she endured for about 20 hours is beyond words. I once lived in an area of Louisiana filled with thick woods. My friend and I were around 13 at the time, and we loved sneaking out at night to explore. We discovered that the drainage pipes along the roadside were just big enough for us to crouch through. So we climbed in and started walking, leaving small markers to guide ourselves back. After maybe 40 minutes of wandering through, we emerged from a manhole that placed us somewhere deep in the middle of nowhere in the forest. As we kept walking, we came across an old 2-story shack with no road leading up to it, no way for any vehicle to reach it. What might have been its front yard was scattered with half-buried toys, all looking very old-fashioned. The yard was littered with porcelain dolls buried halfway in the dirt. The windows were too grimy to see through, so we threw a rock to break one and climbed inside. Any furniture that might have been there had long since rotted, leaving only iron frames behind. The entire floor was covered with empty, rusted oil cans, like the kind you'd see in cartoons from the 1940s. We wanted to go upstairs, but the staircase had decayed and collapsed. So, after a bit, we decided to leave and head back toward the manhole. As we were walking away, I glanced back at the cabin, and there, in the upper window, I swear I saw a kid, maybe 8 or 9, staring back at me. He had short, straight black hair, and to this day, I'm convinced that what I saw was a Camping along the French River in northern Ontario is no easy feat for those unfamiliar with the area. The location is deep in the wilderness. To get there, we had to leave our car, canoe for a few hours, and then portage to our camping spot. This time, we planned a 10-day stay with 4 of us in the group, and we didn't encounter anyone else nearby. On our 3rd day, we decided on an early hike along the northern riverbank. One of my friends, who was great at reading maps and organizing hikes, estimated that it would be a 9-hour round trip back to camp. We started at 6 a.m., and by midday we took a break to cool off in the river and enjoy some lunch we'd packed, along with a beer or two. While packing up to continue, we noticed a small cabin roughly 25 meters downstream. Since we'd be returning the same way, we packed our trash, including the beer cans, tied it up and hung it in a tree, a common practice to keep wildlife away from any food scraps. On the hike, I kept feeling as if someone was watching us, though there was no sign of anyone around. When we finally reached the end of the hike, feeling tired but pleased with the distance we covered, we debated taking another rest. I admitted I wanted to get back to camp because I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. To my surprise, 2 of my friends confessed to feeling the same. We agreed to start back. When we arrived at our resting spot where we'd swum, we discovered that our trash bag was no longer in the tree. It had been taken down, untied, and emptied, not torn or damaged as it would be by an animal, but carefully opened and left on the ground. Remembering the old cabin we'd spotted earlier, we looked around, but there was no trace of it anymore. Then we noticed something odd on a nearby rock. Our beer cans, all 8 of them, were neatly stacked in a pyramid. Beneath one of the cans was a Polaroid photo of us swimming. In shock, we half walked, half ran back to camp, arriving just as night fell. That evening, we agreed to cut our trip short and leave the next day. None of us slept that night, instead sitting around the fire, anxiously waiting for morning. At first light, we packed up, hiked out with our canoes, and were beyond relieved to find our cars right where we'd left them. We drove home in silence, deeply unsettled by the experience. Once, while wandering the woods with my first girlfriend, we stumbled upon something strange at the bottom of a small, secluded valley. There was a tiny round table, painted pink, with chairs arranged neatly around it. Little teacups rested on matching saucers, giving the whole setup an eerie vibe, though we found it oddly fascinating. We glanced around the area and noticed a worn stuffed animal and a child's backpack with a unicorn theme lying nearby. We didn't open the backpack. It felt like we'd hit the peak of this is creepy, and decided to leave it alone. I did happen to pick it up, though, and saw the initials CB written on it. That evening, without my girlfriend, my curiosity got the better of me, so I looked into it. I found out there had been a young girl with those initials who disappeared about a year earlier. Her remains had been discovered in another region, but I still can't shake the feeling that we might have stumbled across a scene tied to something horrible. I can't recall if anyone was ever arrested in her case, but since I never reported what we saw, I might never know. When I was about 12, my friend and I were searching for mushrooms. While we were out there, I found a bag that had a terrible odor. We were far out in the forest, and people sometimes discard animals in these parts because it's unfortunately common here. Still, nobody would typically hike this far into the woods just for that. I bent down and touched the bag, and I'm certain I felt what seemed like a human elbow. It was soft and didn't feel like animal fur at all. My dad stopped me right then and told me to leave it alone and not mention it to anyone. I still regret it and wish I could remember where it was to go back and look.